The idea that mainstream conservatives are anti-government is simply not true. And Arthur and I try to make that point in our first op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, where we quoted Hayek in The Road to Serfdom. Even Hayek said that he reminded us that the state has legitimate and critical functions, from rectifying market failures to securing some minimum standard of living, close quote. Edmund Burke, in many ways the founder of modern conservatism, was a champion of ordered liberty, recognizing the impossibility of one without the other. Recent history is filled with examples of conservative leaders. Think about Rudy Giuliani. Think about what he did to clean up the police department in New York. Living in New York City is not the same as it was before he arrived. I've also embraced energetic yet limited government with my roadmap for America's future. It is a plan that does not do away with government. It's a plan that does not even do away with all of these entitlement programs. It's a plan that makes these entitlement programs sustainable. It's a plan that makes these programs something that we can live with in the next century while keeping a limited government in a free enterprise society. I'll talk more about that in a minute, but I'd like to expand upon this idea that energetic government is impossible without limits. Big government is lethargic government. A government whose size and scope is not properly limited will always seek to raise taxes before it looks for ways to innovate and do more with less. This is why those who do not share our attention to limited government have insisted that higher taxes are always the best way and the easiest and first approach to close our yawning deficits. I see this every day in Congress. This is a solution that I have rejected, not simply because I'm married to some magical, mythical, absolutely perfect tax revenue level per GDP. It's something that I have a fundamental difference with, because those who think our biggest problem is not enough revenue, I just disagree with. In fact, focusing just on size entirely misses the point. We should not be asking, how big should our government be? We should be asking, what is our government for? What is its purpose? Should government enforce the rules, or should it pick winners and losers? Should government provide a basic safety net, or set up an enormous transfer program to fund entitlements for the middle class and the wealthy? Is government instituted by us to secure our liberties and allow us to thrive, compatible with a state that consumes an ever-growing share of the private economy? Rather than focus on size alone, we should be asking, what makes America exceptional? Who are we and what do we aspire to be at this juncture in our history at the beginning of this century? Abraham Lincoln said it probably best, quote, "The progress by which the poor, honest, industrious, and resolute man raises himself, that he may work on his own account and hire somebody else, is the great principle for which this government was really formed," end quote. Do we want to have an opportunity society with a robust, circumscribed safety net so that Lincoln's resolute man is free to work, to take chances, or to better himself? Or do we want to inhabit a stagnant, cradle-to-grave welfare state where opportunity is sacrificed for a misguided vision of equality? If we answer these questions correctly, size of government will take care of itself. If we answer these questions incorrectly, we risk crossing into a tipping point at which the size of government will do irreparable fiscal and moral damage, where we bankrupt the country and turn our safety net into a hammock that lulls able-bodied people into lives of complacency, independency, that drains them of their will to make the most of their lives. We do face a choice and a battle over that choice. Now, the choice on the debt is so massive, the fiscal situation is so massive, that sooner than we think, we will be facing a collapse of our actual social safety net. Should the government fail to reform entitlements, those very programs will collapse under their own weight, and they will bury the next generation with a crushing burden of debt. Clinging to the status quo will not only lead inevitably to economically stifling tax increases, but deep and sudden and highly disruptive benefit cuts. Failing to address this problem now, when necessary adjustments are manageable, assures forced austerity in the near future imposed by credit markets in a state of panic. I serve on the Fiscal Commission, reminded of this every day as we look at these numbers. On the moral side, I find the prospect of irreparable moral damage just as troubling, and as I know David does as well. Europe's people have labored under the rock of its welfare state for decades. And now Europe's debt crisis has lifted this rock, and we see the moral ugliness that has developed underneath. You turn on the TV and watch French teenagers lobbing Molotov cocktails at each other and at cars, burning down schools, protesting in advancement of the retirement age for fat pensions that they haven't even begun to work yet. Take a look at British university students who are shattering windows because they don't want to share the cost of their own educations. Greek mobs murdering bank tellers because their workplace happens to be a symbol of fiscal reality. Good grief. Let's contrast these riots with the Tea Party protests that we've watched over the last year or two. Instead of taking to the streets to demand more from the government, these citizens took to the streets peacefully to ask the government to do less, to take less, and to return itself to the role government was envisioned by our founders. David has argued that the Tea Party's conception of this nation's founding principles is flawed, and that energetic government has always been a part of this country's tradition. I agree with David on the second part, but I think he has missed what the Tea Party has picked up on, and that is the current president's vision for this country represents a shift, not just in the size of government, but in the kind of government we have. Nowhere has this been on more vivid display than in the healthcare debate. The overriding problem with healthcare is the fact that healthcare costs and prices go faster than the rate of inflation. It outpaces our incomes. So we know we're on an irreconcilable path. There are two approaches that simply cannot be reconciled. One approach is represented by the Democrats' healthcare bill, the Affordable Choice Act. Everybody calls this Obamacare, with its trillion-dollar expansion of government and its reliance on the same kinds of price controls that have failed for decades and decades to control costs. The approach outlined by some of us, one that I offered with Alice Rivlin, Brookings Institute, former Clinton OMB secretary, vice chair of the Fed, she and I offered a different approach. One that simply says we will deliver premium support to individuals. We will run the money through the individual instead of from the government. We will peg that support to a rate closer to general inflation, and we will use a decentralized market process to discover efficiencies. There's basically two ways to go. You run the money through the individual, make them more powerful, reform our insurance laws so that they can have power, and that the providers of health insurance, health care, hospitals, doctors, insurers compete against each other for our business in a market-based situation, or we run the money through the government. And we trickle it down top to bottom through price controls and formulas. That's the choice we have on healthcare before us. I like to think of the plan that I've offered as an example of energetic, smart government. It takes the Burkean approach to working to conserve arrangements that people have built their lives around. The radicals are those who are committed to the centralized approach, to cost control and a blank check version of entitlement reform, even though this approach has manifestly failed. There is nothing that disturbs me more in this debate than to think of my kids coming into a country and a society where they're more likely to be dependent upon the government for their future than they are upon themselves. That is the most disturbing and demoralizing thought of all of them.